That's why it's called as invasion,
Okay.
of course. The plant species that we have here in Kashmir, in Kashmir we call it as shalot.
Charlotte?
Shalot.
Okay. Scientifically think and go kya? What does it mean?
The difference between philosophy and science is
He's a global voice in invasion biology and plant ecology. Professor Manzoor Ahmad Shah. My first question to you is, what sparked your interest in invasion biology?
it is a subject that deals with organisms, their interactions with the environment, and their interactions between themselves. Close your eyes and think about how many organisms, for that matter, I am linked to. It's a real complex web. All the building diversity that we see here looks good, but all of it is not equally good because there are some native species that originated here, that evolved here, that are part and parcel of this landscape right from the day one. But there are the plants or the animals that have been brought or introduced from the other regions, which are
Okay.
playing a very kind of negative role so far the interactions with the other species are concerned.
Is it that why we call it invasion?
Yes, that's why it's called as invasion,
Okay.
of course. Because as for example, you see yourself or our kids, when they are at home, they are very well behaved kids because they have the pressure of parents in the school, pressure of teachers in the neighborhood, pressure of neighbors.
Okay.
Imagine a situation where there is
When,
no
when
such
they
pressure.
leave home.
When there is no such pressure,
Pressure.
and you leave them at a place, how do they behave there?
they
So
make
their
everything a
character
mess.
would be actually determined there.
Right.
Same is the case with the plant species, and because once these plant species are introduced from their native range to a non-native range,
Okay.
they leave their enemies behind, the enemies that they have evolved there with. The co-evolved enemies. We call it as enemy release.
Very interesting.
And once they do so, in the non-native region, what they do is they basically, since they have left their enemies behind, their parasites, their pathogens, instead of investing their resources in defense against these enemies, they invest their resources more towards growth. The plant species that we have here in Kashmir, in Kashmir we call it as shalot.
Charlotte?
Shalot,
Okay.
Cuneiza canadensis,
Okay.
Canadian horseweed in the common language. So this is quite invasive here in all the disturbed places, roadsides. It's quite invasive here. This species, for example, in its native range, does not disturb or negatively impact the species that co-occur with it.
Okay.
But in the non-native ranges, and that non-native range was not only in Kashmir. It was in Kashmir, it was in China, it was in Europe, many places of Europe and other places. We found that there was a very negative relationship. Then we thought that these species probably undergo a complete, transformation in their ecological fortune as they move from the native to the non-native regions. So, is it because of the variation in the genetic diversity? We sampled the species from the global range of its occurrence and found that, there are reasons, climate, genetic diversity, and other reasons. And now, many people ask many questions about it, and they say that this is a new model species in invasion biology, what we call as new Arabidopsis of the invasion biology. Picking up from there, say how, for example, the soil microbes play an important role. Recently, on this Cuneiza, there is a paper published compares how the soil biota influences the invasiveness of the species, and we have proposed a kind of a support for a new hypothesis, what we call as enhanced mutualism hypothesis, that in the non-native regions, these species are smart enough to draw soil microbes to their advantage at the cost of the non-native, these native species or the neighboring species there. So they deprive them of the advantages, but get them to their own advantage and proliferate and basically invade.
Right. मंजूर साहब, normally जब हम देखते हैं कि अश्वना terms only गसान use, we say कि scientific thinking. Это कि scientifically इंसान सोचुन. Scientific temperament सच है ज़रूरत एम चीज़ खतर एम सोच खतर. What does this term actually mean? Scientifically think and go kya? What does it mean?
When you think about, say, why I am existing in this world, what's the purpose of my existence? What makes us human beings different than rest of the creatures is the faculty of thinking. We are the rational beings, and by rational beings, we are supposed to ask questions.
Right.
We are supposed to basically think. Science is all about questioning everything, putting everything to doubt until and unless you don't prove it. God has given everything that is in the closet, every secret that is hidden in this universe,
Okay.
the inherent potential of coming out of that closet,
Right.
but asked us to scratch it a bit, right? And that's basically you scratch it a bit by asking questions. So why a tree is a tree and shrub is a shrub and herb is a herb? Is also a question.
Okay.
Why a tree is not a grass for that matter? Why is it so that, for example, sheep have somehow rendered themselves to be domesticated over the course of evolution, but for example, wild animals
Have
like
not.
lions have not? If you think why of it,
Right.
how of it, that is
But
science.
But philosophy also says why and how of things. Why is not science philosophy? Like Descartes, for example, he once said, "Cogito ergo sum." I think, I doubt, therefore I am. So why is not philosophy science then?
The difference between philosophy and science is that science believes in proving everything in a tangible way so that you can kind of prove to anyone that it is, for example, like this. But philosophy to me is not different than science because philosophy provides you the rationale behind science. It helps you to connect the dots in science. It helps you to create stories out of science. And if a good science does not create a story,
Right.
it is not,
It's not science.
at all. Philosophy helps you to convert that knowledge into wisdom
Okay.
and then use that wisdom to basically take better decisions in life, which are, if you look at, for example, what has made difference between West and East in terms of the science and technology so far, probably it is because of the fact that you have this scientific temperament very much ingrained in the societies there, which is not the case here. In France, you will see, for example, in Paris, there is a tomb of Louis Pasteur. So in Kashmir, for example, you have a lot of praise for these people from literature, which we should have, of course, poets and other people. But I don't see many scientists basically part of the discourse the way they should be there out in the media.
Right.
Of course, they also have very interesting stories to say.
Yes.
That means somehow
They are
do
more
not,
important in
we do
a
not
way.
celebrate science the way it deserves to be celebrated.
Right.
So my point is, we need to encourage our children, our students, to ask questions. Unfortunately, what I see largely the trend is the students are afraid of asking questions in the classrooms. The difference that I have seen in the schools and the colleges, for that matter, here, especially at the school level, you would see that museums and such places of natural history, which are very important, which are the repositories of knowledge, they are very busy places. And also the libraries in the West and the other. You have every day many school kids coming and just looking at human evolution in working models. How did it start and how for example, it go? The way science explains it, I
Okay.
need to say. In Canada, there's a place called Biodome. Biodome, you see, it's a biological universe they have created under those artificial conditions,
Right.
and you get a feel of that. What do you mean by an ocean? What do you mean by a tropical forest? What do you mean by a wetland? What do you mean by a grassland? And what are the grasslands of Africa looking like, and how they are different than this? So once you see these things at that age,
Right.
since we teach our students only from the books,
Right.
we
So-
never expose them to the realities of it.
They show, we talk.
Yeah, they show, we talk.
Right.
What matters for them is, once we do experiment next is what happens.
Next.
What happens next?
Okay.
That curiosity, that eureka feeling
Right.
is basically what science is.
Right. Yus zan Kashmir mun ch khas kar saath science ch kat karan ya ch yiwan MBBS yani medical ya engineering zehnas nu. Even to yeh cha science. Kaz bih chus vesan agis parents te bozi student te sare society as a whole wucho to window at mutalik yeh cha science.
Mugan tohi mugana ticha esi. Tachu waja yiki ashu bachan wonmutu issue science. Achu bachan wonmutu ya dichu MBBS nachu engineering. So that blame partly comes to us as parents, as teachers. अगर आप देखेंगे लास्ट ईयर के 2 नोबेल प्राइजेस जो मिले वो आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस में मिले.
Yes.
एक उन लोगों को मिला जिन्होंने आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस को डिस्कवर किया एज ए टेक्नोलॉजी
Right.
ओवर द पीरियड ऑफ देयर लॉन्ग रिसर्च.
Sure.
दूसरा है जिनको फिजियोलॉजी एंड मेडिसिन में मिला इसलिए कि उन्होंने इसको यूज करके वो सिंथेटिक प्रोटीन्स या मेडिसिन ये बनाने का ये दे दिया. सो I mean, this data science is coming in a big way, using artificial intelligence, using machine learning, using what you call as deep learning. So these these things you cannot basically ignore. And चाहे MBBS की आप इंजीनियरिंग की बात करेंगे, they are all now AI driven. तो आजकल के ज़माने में आपको मैं बता दूँ मतलब क्लाइमेट चेंज यह है मेजर इशू मगर अच्छी पता है कि अमिक फॉल आउट्स कई खासकर Himalayan regions,
Right.
because Himalaya is warming at a faster rate than the global average.
Right.
And its implications in terms of erosion of biodiversity, in terms of depletion of the glaciers, in terms of huge impacts on our natural resources. So which even area was because opportunities. Magar sawal chu ki we need to tell our kids and students to basically think about these problems and see how they can become part of the solution. एक डिपार्टमेंट है उधर एनवायरमेंटल इंजीनियरिंग जब उधर गई फैकल्टीज के साथ इंटरेक्शन करना था.
अच्छा.
तो मोस्ट ऑफ द फैकल्टीज आई एम स्टीफन आई हैव सॉल्व्ड दिस प्रॉब्लम फॉर एग्जांपल आई एम फलानी आई हैव सॉल्व्ड दिस प्रॉब्लम. एवरीबडी वुड इंट्रोड्यूस देमसेल्व्स एज प्रॉब्लम सॉल्वर्स. और उस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में अगर हम अपने आप को देखें कि हमने साइंस किया कौन सी प्रॉब्लम सॉल्व की.
Right. Well, make us understand what it is to have a scientific temper.
If you fall sick, यहाँ पे हमें अक्सर बोलते हैं चश्मे तसुरदार छु गोमुत खुशमुत माचु हाँ बेमार छु गोमुत की ये फर्स्ट इंप्रेशन हाँ चीर मात्रा जिन माप्यो this is our first impression. So their first impression is अच्छा if you fall sick what could be the reason. Is it probably that he has smelled something wrong, or for that matter he was exposed to high temperature,
out in the
cold. Yeah, they would do this, and then they would basically think in scientific terms.
Rationally.
Their first reaction rather towards this would be to think scientifically. Say what would be the scientific approach of tackling this. Ours would be more peer services. She was for. So we as scientists need to kind of have the clear policy points out of our research. When I read the poetry of Sheikhul Alam, there's a mention of more than 50 plant species in his poetry. And when you look at the context in which he has used them, and when you try to interpret it in present day's context, it seems that Sheikhul Alam is still alive and he's speaking to us. This dialogue of wisdom needs to be promoted.